Did you have an opinion, Kat? Today, we are talking about the history of life on Earth. It's one of my favorite chapters because you get to learn about how these non living particles gave rise to living things. And if it can happen here, then conditions could be right for it to happen on another planet. And beyond that, our planet has a rich history of life that has lived, died, thrived, conquered, and changed the planet before humans were even a thought. So let's talk about the rich history of life of our home planet, planet Earth. So our lovely planet that we honestly do not treat very well is about 4.6 billion years old. I know it's hard to fathom how old that is, given that the average human lifespan is what 70 to 80 years old. For the first 600 million years, the Earth spent colliding with chunks of rock and ice, and this prevented the formation of seas and lakes. The early atmosphere, which is that layer of gas that surround the Earth's surface, it had very little oxygen, but it had lots of water vapor plus compounds released by volcanic eruptions on the surface, like nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen. And over time, the Earth cooled and the water vapor condensed into liquid that made our lakes and oceans. So, how did life originate? Scientists hypothesized that chemical and physical processes could have produced simple cells through four steps. The first being that the abiotic synthesis, which means non-living molecules creating small organic molecules, such as amino acids and nitrogenous bases, the molecules that have carbon. Two, the joining of these small molecules into macromolecules, such as proteins and nucleic acids. Three, the packaging of these molecules into protocells, which are droplets with membranes that maintain an internal chemistry different from that of its surroundings. Remember phospholipids, they can spontaneously form membranes because of their hydrophobic nature, their water-fearing nature. And so they can enclose some molecules on the inside and some molecules on the outside of a protocell. And four, the origin of self-replicating molecules that eventually made inheritance possible. So this might sound speculative, but there are experiments to test parts of this hypothesis, and it has produced data that supports this. So let's talk about some of those. It's a little bit of a history lesson. Back in the 1920s, a Russian chemist named Opagin and a British scientist, Haldane, independently hypothesized that Earth's early atmosphere was a reducing environment. That means that it's an electron adding environment. And this is usually caused by decreased levels of oxygen. And in this environment, organic compounds could have formed from simpler molecules. The energy to power the synthesis could have come from lightning and UV radiation because the Earth was exposed to the sun. In the 1950s, which wasn't that long ago, two scientists, Miller and Urey, tested the Opagin-Haldane hypothesis by creating lab conditions similar to the conditions that scientists believe existed on early Earth. So using the presence of similar mixture of gases. So they set up this experiment where there was water vapor, there was methane, ammonia, and other volcanic compounds. They simulated electricity for lightning, and in the water that they collected, they tested for the presence of organic molecules. That experiment yielded a variety of amino acids, along with plenty of others. Many laboratories have repeated that experiment using different recipes for the atmosphere, and some of those conditions also produce organic compounds. Some evidence suggests that the early atmosphere may not have been reducing, but instead a neutral atmosphere. And the Miller-Urey experiments have been repeated in neutral atmospheres, and those have also produced organic molecules. It is speculated that even if the atmosphere was neutral, that the openings of volcanoes had reducing environments, so life could have started there. Another hypothesis is that organic compounds were first produced in deep-sea hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are areas on the seafloor where hot minerals in the earth gush into the seawater, producing a dark, hot, oxygen-deficient environment, like the one pictured to the right. Some of these vents are so hot that the environment is unstable, but others, like alkaline vents, release water that is warm, but has a high pH of 9 to 11. Do you remember if that's an acidic or a basic pH? It's a basic pH. So it has a high pH of 9 to 11, and that environment may have been suitable for life to start. Additional experiments show that it is possible for organic molecules to be synthesized under these conditions. Another source of organic molecules may have been meteorites. For example, fragments of the Murchison meteorite, which is a 4.5 billion year old rock that landed in Australia in 1969, contained more than 80 amino acids. It also had some lipids, some simple sugars, and nitrogenous bases like uracil. So that could have been where the organic molecules came from. If simple organic molecules could form, how did macromolecules form? How did they start to polymerize? A 2009 study demonstrated that RNA monomers like cytosine and uracil could be produced spontaneously from simple organic molecules. In addition, when amino acids or RNA nucleotides are concentrated onto hot sand or clay or rock, polymers form spontaneously without the help of enzymes or ribosomes. Remember that a monomer is just the one building block, one unit, and the polymer is a chain of those units. So we're talking about how does this one building block form bonds with other building blocks to form a chain without the help of ribosomes or enzymes. And if the conditions are right, it can happen. So organic molecules can form from inorganic molecules. Organic molecules can polymerize into macromolecules without the help of enzymes under certain conditions. But how was the first cell made? Remember, one of those macromolecules are lipids, and lipids have that unique character where they spontaneously form bilayered vesicles in water to keep their nonpolar parts hidden away from water. Scientists have found that the presence of montmorillonite clay, which is a soft mineral clay produced by volcanic ash, greatly increases vesicle formation. So if you can imagine, they measured vesicle formation with and without montmorillonite clay present. Montmorillonite clay increases vesicle formation. When vesicles do form, whatever molecules that happen to be on the inside, like amino acids or nucleotides, are now separated from those on the outside. Recent experiments show that abiotically produced vesicles, so vesicles from non-living molecules, can exhibit certain properties of life, including simple reproduction and metabolism, and maintaining an internal environment different from their surroundings. So that is evidence of how life started, which is honestly amazing. And some of this research happened very recently and continues to happen. So if this is a topic that you're skeptical about or interested in, you can absolutely pursue asking questions about how life started. After life started, some of life was documented in fossils. So we're going to talk about how fossils form and how scientists date how old they are and what they can and cannot tell us about the history of life. So we've learned before that most fossils are made in sedimentary rock. We can determine the sequence in which they fossilize based on the layers or the strata of the rock. Fossils can also be found in non-rocks like amber, which is fossilized tree sap, and also frozen in soil, like this wolf pup here. As mentioned before, the fossil record is incomplete. Few organisms have been fossilized, and even fewer have been discovered. Fossilization favors species that existed for a long time, were abundant and widespread, and it's more likely for us to find them. And having hard body parts like shells or skeletons is beneficial because soft fleshy parts are easier to break down. But even with its limitations, the fossil record provides a detailed record of change over time, and gaps in the fossil record continue to be filled with new discoveries made by paleontologists who search for and study fossils. Transitional forms are special types of fossils that show intermediate states between an ancestral form and that of its descendants that live today. These further support evolution. In this image, we have the skull of today's gray whale, where the nostrils are found at the top of the skull. The fossil of an ancestor to the gray whale, Aetocetus, shows that the nostrils were then found in the middle of the skull. And an even older fossil and ancestor named Pakicetus shows that the nostrils once existed at the front of the skull. Pakicetus was a land mammal, and Aetocetus is the transitional form, who lived in water. So how do we know how old fossils are? Which came first, which came second? Maybe they didn't appear in sedimentary rock and they're not in layers. So when I say dating fossils, I mean determining how old they are. There is relative dating, where you can at least determine that fossils found in upper layers are younger than fossils found in lower layers that have been covered in layers and layers of volcanic ash and other sediment. Then there's radiometric dating. Radiometric dating can determine the age of fossils themselves and the age of volcanic rocks around them. Radiometric dating uses the decay of radioactive isotopes to determine the age of things. Remember that isotopes are atoms with more or less neutrons, and radioactive isotopes decay at a constant rate. The decay of each isotope is known as the half-life. That's the time required for 50% of a parent isotope to decay into a daughter isotope. So parent isotopes decay into daughter isotopes. Carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years. It takes that many years for half of the parent isotope to decay into daughter isotopes. So in this graph, the half-lives represent the x-axis and the number of parent isotopes remaining are on the y-axis. And after one half-life, half of the parent isotopes decayed. After another half-life, half of what was remaining decayed. And then that will be cut in half again and again. And so that's why it forms a curved line and not a straight line. So scientists will compare the ratio of non-radioactive elements in a fossil that don't change over time to the radioactive elements. So often they'll compare the presence of carbon-12, which is not radioactive, to radioactive carbon-14. The study of fossils has helped geologists establish a geologic record, which is a standard time scale that divides Earth's history into 4 eons, and some more subdivisions because biologists and geologists love to chop things up. It makes it easier to understand. So the 4 eons are the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and the Phanerozoic. My personal phrase to remember the eons and eras is, did you happen to pay me cash? PMC stands for the 3 eras that divide the most recent eon, the Phanerozoic eon. And so those 3 eras are the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic era. They are characterized by the organisms that lived during that time, and they're separated by major extinction events. So this chart has a lot of information in it and more time frames and periods that divide the eras even further. It's table 25.1 in the text because it's a little small here to see, but it does include all of the eons and eras and some important events that happened during the history of life. To emphasize some of those major events and just to show you how little time our species has been on this planet, I'm showing you a different representation of the time periods. So in this circle, we have starting around 1 p.m., the Earth was born. And the first eon started, the Hadean eon, where no life existed. In the next eon, the Archean eon, it lasted a little longer, and this is when the first prokaryotes existed, like archaea and bacteria. And then just before the Proterozoic era, oxygen in the atmosphere increased, and the first single-celled eukaryotes existed, as well as multicellular eukaryotes. Towards the end of the Proterozoic, animals first appeared, and they are so distantly related to the animals that we know today that you probably wouldn't recognize them. It's only in the last eon, the Phanerozoic, separated into the eras Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic, did the colonization of land occur. And that tiny sliver of time that you can hardly see in this figure is the existence of humans. So we've got a lot of time to cover. Let's begin. Earth's first organisms were single-celled prokaryotes that lived in the ocean. The earliest evidence of these organisms comes from fossilized stromatolites. Stromatolites are layered rocks that form when certain prokaryotes bind thin films of sediment together. These early prokaryotes were Earth's only life forms for like 1.5 billion years. Single-celled organisms may seem small and insignificant today, but during this time, they transformed life on our planet. 1.5 billion years is a long time for prokaryotes to evolve. During that time, prokaryotes similar to today's cyanobacteria evolved the ability to perform photosynthesis. Do you remember what were the products of photosynthesis? Sugar and oxygen. Key word here, oxygen. The free oxygen produced by early prokaryotes probably dissolved in the surrounding water until it accumulated and saturated the water until it finally gassed out into the atmosphere. This is known as the oxygen revolution. The levels of oxygen were steadily increasing until it increased drastically. It shot up. And oxygen isn't harmless. It can actually attack chemical bonds, inhibit enzymes, damage cells, so this revolution likely drove a lot of prokaryotes to extinction. The survivors either lived in anaerobic environments without oxygen or they adapted and they used oxygen for cellular respiration. The next major event was the appearance of eukaryotes. The first eukaryotes arose about 1.8 billion years ago through a process known as endosymbiosis. Endosymbiosis is a process where a prokaryotic cell engulfed a smaller cell and both lived symbiotically, in which both cells benefited, the inner and the outer cell, and the smaller cell likely evolved into the mitochondrion that we know today. Endo means inside or into, and symbiosis means a mutually beneficial relationship. So by having the smaller cell inside the larger cell, they developed a mutually beneficial relationship. This diagram is showing you that a prokaryote with a plasma membrane, cytoplasm, and DNA. Over time, infolding of the plasma membrane developed into the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, a highly membranous organelle. This also developed the nuclear envelope that housed the nucleus that contained the DNA. So that's how the prokaryote evolved membrane-bound organelles. Next, the cell likely engulfed an aerobic bacterium, which later would become the mitochondrion. And after that, some eukaryotes engulfed a photosynthetic bacterium, which becomes the plastid in this ancestral eukaryote. A plastid is a photosynthetic organelle. You're probably more familiar with a chloroplast, which is a type of plastid found in the green leaves of plants. Scientists hypothesized that this was the sequence of events, that mitochondria appeared first because all eukaryotes have mitochondria and not all of them have plastids. Endosymbiosis explains why modern-day mitochondria and chloroplasts are the only organelles to have their own DNA and ribosomes. They evolved from tiny cells that lived symbiotically with larger cells. Over time, the host and endosymbiont became one as they became interdependent. The origin of structurally complex eukaryotic cells sparked the evolution of greater structural diversity. Some of those single-celled eukaryotes started working together, sharing tasks. Cells communicate. The oldest multicellular fossil that we've discovered and identified is that of red algae. Single-celled and multi-celled eukaryotes appeared in the Proterozoic eon. And towards the end of this eon, called the Ediacaran period, larger, soft-bodied animals arose. I included this chart to show you that the "did you happen to pay me cash" is a phrase only to remember the eons and the eras. But there are even smaller time frames that we use to divide the time into smaller periods. The Ediacarian period is the only named period in the Proterozoic eon. And this is where animals first appeared. This time, during the first three eons, the Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic eon, is sometimes referred to as the Precambrian era, because it's the time before this first period here of the Phanerozoic era, the Cambrian era. So you might see that in your text. So the first few animals to appear were sponges, cnidarians like sea anemones and their relatives, and mollusks like snails and clams. The evolution of multicellularity drove the diversification of algae, plants, fungi, and animals. And when I say drove the diversity, I mean animals blew up. The next era started, the Paleozoic era, and that first period is named the Cambrian period. And there's a reason why we call this next major event the Cambrian explosion. During this period, several animal groups that resemble modern-day phyla suddenly appeared. This time period provided the first evidence of predator and prey interactions. So basically, this is when animals started fighting. Prior to the Cambrian explosion, all large animals were soft-bodied. Predatory adaptations like large bodies and claws appeared, and defensive adaptations like sharp spines and body armor appeared in prey species. Overall, animals originated about 700 million years ago during the Ediacaran period, and then they remained small for over 100 million years until they diversified explosively during the Cambrian and beyond. The next big event was the colonization of land, because prior to this, most, if not all, organisms were living in the water. Some prokaryotes lived on terrestrial surfaces billions of years ago, but larger forms of life, like fungi, plants, animals, they didn't begin to colonize the land until about 500 million years ago. So this gradual venture out of aquatic environments was associated with adaptations that made it possible to reproduce on land. and adaptations that help prevent dehydration because organisms in the water were pretty dependent on the water. Plants today have a vascular system, which is an internal transport system for moving materials internally that prevent dehydration. And plants also have a waterproof coating called the cuticle on their leaves that slows water loss. Some of these dehydration preventing adaptations were present millions of years ago, where plants didn't have roots or leaves yet, but they did evolve vascular systems to transport materials. Animals later evolved the ability to lay shelled amniotic eggs, where embryos are able to develop in drier places without drying out. Non-vascular plants likely colonized land first, later evolving vascular systems, and fungi followed suit shortly after. And they likely had a close relationship with plants, as it's seen in fossils, similar to the symbiotic relationship that fungi have with plant roots today. Of the animals, arthropods were the first animals to appear. So those are animals like insects and spiders. Then came tetrapods, which means four legs, so four-legged animals. And this was millions of years ago. Only 195,000 years ago, the human species evolved. Earth's history is characterized by the rise and fall of new types of organisms. This is due to speciation and major extinction events, and these patterns can be explained by a few things. One of those is continental drift. So continental drift is a process where the tectonic plates on Earth's surface gradually shift over time. It's only a few centimeters per year, so you don't notice. But this image outlines the borders of those plates, where they are moving away from each other, towards each other, or sliding past each other like they are just off California. This movement alters the habitats in which organisms live, because the movements can cause the creation of mountains, volcanoes, earthquakes, and more. Organisms must adapt to this changing environment, move somewhere else, or go extinct. In case you didn't know this before, the 7 continents that we know today were once one giant landmass called Pangaea, but it's separated due to plate tectonics. Based on their current movement, geologists have predicted that a new supercontinent will form about 250 million years from now. Another major thing affecting the rise and fall of organisms are mass extinctions. Extinctions do occur regularly, but a mass extinction is a dramatic increase in the extinction rate of organisms, leading to a great decline of biodiversity. There have been 5 mass extinctions, and in all of them, half of marine species went extinct. They are named after the period in which they occurred. So there's one called the Ordovician-Silurian extinction that occurred between those two periods. The Devonian occurred at the end of the Devonian period. The Permian, a really prominent mass extinction, occurred at the end of the Permian. The Triassic-Jurassic extinction occurred between those periods. And the Cretaceous happened at the end of the Cretaceous period. So here's a list of all of the mass extinction events. The Permian and the Cretaceous are most notable. They mark the boundary between eras. The Permian extinction claimed about 96% of marine and animal species. And this drastically altered life in the ocean. Even though it occurred over a period of 500,000 years, that was a very short time in geologic time. The Permian extinction occurred during a time when volcanoes were very active. These eruptions produced enough carbon dioxide to warm the global climate by 6 degrees, which caused many temperature-sensitive species to die. And the rise in carbon dioxide also acidifies the ocean, which made it uninhabitable for many species. The Cretaceous mass extinction occurred 66 million years ago. The presence of a very rare earth mineral called iridium leads scientists to believe that there is a massive meteorite collision that introduced more of this element, while also blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to drop for months to years. We believe that the Chicxulub crater in Mexico was created by this asteroid, which is about 10 kilometers wide. Scientists continue to do research surrounding these mass extinction events. And lastly, we may be in the midst of a 6th mass extinction. That is human caused. It's not completely decided, but just in the last 400 years, 1,000 species have gone extinct. And this is a rate much faster than normally seen in the fossil record. Scientists monitor the number of organisms living in different habitats, and these programs show that many species are declining due to habitat loss, the introduction of new invasive species that didn't normally live there, over-harvesting by humans, and plenty of other factors. They also note that the extinction rates tend to increase during climate change. So unless we humans do something about it, a 6th human-led mass extinction is likely to occur in the next few centuries. Mass extinctions can have a drastic effect on which organisms die, which survive, and what the environment looks like afterwards. Mass extinctions do pave the way for adaptive radiations, which is the rapid evolution of diversely adapted species from one common ancestor. If you think about it, when species die out, there is now more space, more resources for the surviving species. Following the Cretaceous extinction, mammals widely diversified. Adaptive radiations don't only occur after mass extinctions, though. They also occur after the evolution of new features, like when tetrapods adapted to colonize land, and there were very few predators or competition, so they were able to explore and adapt to the various habitats on land. It's also caused by the colonization of new regions, like the diversification of Darwin's finches as they colonized other islands. The ancestral finch mostly ate seeds and had a very specific beak size and shape. But as finches spread to various environments, some began to eat more fruit or insects or seeds, and birds with beaks that were most efficient for eating that kind of food source survived, thrived, and reproduced into the very diverse group of finches that we see today. And now, if it helps you at all, maybe you should ask somebody today, did you happen to pay me cash? Just asking.